Hello, linguists. Welcome to Modern English, Episode 1. Before we begin, just pause and take a deep breath. You have come through by far the most rigorous and demanding parts of this course. Think of where we've been. We've been through our goofy language. You memorized all of those IPA symbols. You learned Old English, including all those inflectional endings. We've examined Middle English, and now we arrive on the shore of Modern English. The theme of this unit will be standardization, the beginning of standardization, as the image there shows. And we'll talk about such things as printing and how the rise of Gutenberg's printing press enabled standardization to take the place of multiplicity, dialectical variation. We'll talk about the role of Shakespeare. We'll talk about the role of the King James Version of the Bible. We'll talk about America, because now there's one of those coming, and the role of the British Empire in spreading English around the world. And we'll also finally talk about the development of some modern attitudes towards language, and in fact some modern concepts of what language is that are actually completely out of step with every linguist's understanding of language. So pat yourself on the back, and let's begin what I think should be an increasingly familiar and enjoyable unit as we see how all of those forms of language that English has been turn into what we know as our English. By the way, if you're a literary type, these are the authors who are prominent in the early modern period. Sir Philip Sidney, you might know the sonnet sequence Astrophel and Stella. He wrote a very important defense of poetry called Defense of Poesy. Edmund Spenser, famous for the Faerie Queene, which is a marvelous romance, theological, allegorical epic. Christopher Marlowe, near contemporary of Shakespeare, who wrote, Dr. Faustus, Tamburlaine, the Jew of Malta, and of course, William, what's that? Shakespeare? Oh, I think I might have misspelled that. Oops. Actually, the question of the spelling of William Shakespeare's name is something I want to dive into as our first subject. And before we do that, a little side note. By the way, take away from this class several things, one of them being Shakespeare did not write in Old English. Shakespeare is actually early modern English. That's right. Shakespeare, for all that sometimes you have to read him in a parallel translation with all these notes, looks so foreign, uses the these and the thous. People in high school say, oh, it's Old English. No, actually, you can say, well, there was Old English, Beowulf, Cadman. There was Middle English, Chaucer, Ankur na Bríola, and there's early modern English, Sidney and Shakespeare. So, no, that's not Old English. So, the Bard's signature. We have his signature in 6 legal documents that we are pretty sure are his. And the point I want to make by bringing you to this rather specific observation is that standardization had not yet happened as Middle English is turning into modern English. Even Shakespeare, who's sort of universally acknowledged as the most significant, the most important, if not the greatest or best, whatever that means, English author, signed his own name with 6 different spellings. William Shakespeare, William Shakespeare, William Shakespeare, William Shakespeare with an E, and William Shakespeare. By the way, which spelling is missing from those? Think about it, of the last name. The spelling that we're familiar with, by the way, did not become standardized until Cambridge came out with an edition of the complete works of William Shakespeare, Shakespeare, in the 20th century. Editions of Shakespeare and printings of his works went back and forth actually for centuries before the 20th century. So I'll also leave you the thought to ponder. If Shakespeare could do, I think most people would say, pretty okay with words and writing stories, and yet he didn't even have his own name standardized in form. What does that really mean about standardization, about the correctness of spelling, about using language correctly, this attitude that we have to write correctly? Shakespeare did pretty okay and couldn't spell his own name. Is standardization the enemy of creativity? That's something for you to ponder as we move on. Every bit as important as the Anglo-Saxon invasion of the Celts was in about 550 in producing Old English, every bit as important as 1066 was, the Norman conquest of those Germanic Anglo-Saxons to produce Middle English, is that thing in front of you, which produced modern English. No, for the first time, it's not an invasion, not a battle. It's a machine. It's a technology. That's right, the switch from Middle English to modern English, it's a gradual, I can't give a date for it other than the invention of that machine, but we're talking about Gutenberg and his press, the invention of movable type, and we're talking about printing as the beginning of mass communication, because modern English is all about what? Standardization. And that phase of the language is really all about a technology of the written language. So there's no invasion that marks the beginning of modern English. In fact, there's no date. It's a gradual shift from what I would call an oral culture, where language was primarily spoken, to a print culture where people have this idea that the real form of the language is not what we talk, it's the book, that's the prestige form, to get a book published. Oh, well, how do authors write this? What is the correct way? We look to books to be the primary witness of the language. Well, that is a modern development in culture and in the view of language. And so we have to look to technology for this shift to modern English. And the event is Gutenberg. Johannes Gutenberg, that's John Gutenberg. In German, he's a German, even though there is no Germany. There won't be until 1871. There's no nation yet, but they're Germanic-speaking peoples. His movable type printing press, he invents it at, we'll just say, about 1450. That's fine for rough numbers. It then spreads throughout Europe very quickly. Now, we have to think what this one invention enables. You can't really have widespread education. Like today we have universal mandatory education up through, what, age 16? You can't have that without printing. Think about every textbook you have ever been given or bought. What if that had to be written out by hand? Could all of America, basically, and the developed world have been educated? Absolutely not. Cost prohibitive. You know how much scribes cost these days? So literacy, the literacy extending beyond 5 to 10% of the population, that's a feature of modern English. Again, printing makes that possible. I would even argue that national identity, nationalism, is a result of printing. You might think that, oh, well, there's always been a France, there's always been a Germany, there's always been an England. No, these things are a couple of 100 years old. In fact, most of them antedate or after printing, because how do you sort of foment national fervor? How do you unite around causes if there's not a brutal feudal structure in place, which there no longer is? How do you unite around a common form of the language, like the London dialect of English, if you can't spread information, communication cheaply? Printing. The number of dialects, we talked about the 5 dialects, a little bit of Middle English, even more of Old English. Yeah, there are dialects in modern English, and you might think, oh yeah, I say pop, and that person says soda. Oh, and that person says Coke. Wow, dialects. No, those are minuscule differences compared to what we used to have. Languages become standardized. You can go beyond that. The Renaissance really is enabled by the printing press. The spread of humanistic learning, that is studying classical antiquity, Latin and Greek, Roman Empire, Greek Empire, and the renewal of learning that brings. You could argue that the Reformation could not have happened. Northwestern is affiliated with a Protestant denomination. One of the primary movers of the drive toward a Protestant set of denominations was sola scriptura. That is, the Bible alone is the witness or the authority of God. Well, how are you going to know what the Bible says unless you have a Bible? A printed Bible. And then the Enlightenment of the 18th century, the rise of modern science and the empirical method. Scientific results have to be spread. And again, that spread, that communication, that dialogue can't happen unless there's a printing press. You're getting an idea of why when the network A&E put on a show in their biography series, and they counted down the 100 most influential people of the millennium, that is, the people whose lives made the greatest change in culture, in worldview, in the way people lived, that they counted down like this. I remember watching the show. It was a really good show. Galileo changed the way we see the universe, as did Copernicus. Einstein changed the way we see matter and time and space. Karl Marx invented a completely different form of government, which the 20th century experimented with and went very badly, although his ideas in themselves are rather idealistic and sometimes quite beautiful. Christopher Columbus, through whom Europe discovered the New World. William Shakespeare's only number 5. I think he wrote some stuff. Charles Darwin changed the way we see our history as a species and the way life is reproduced. Martin Luther, mover of the Protestant Reformation. Number 2, Isaac Newton, who explains how the most immediate forces like gravity work. Well, who's going to be number 1? Johannes Gutenberg. Why? All the reasons on the previous slide. Because all of the major movements of the last 500 years, which literally could not have taken place had not he or someone else invented movable type, giving us all of those things and giving us modern English. So we're going to talk a little bit about the first texts that got printed. I'm going to give you a new word. Incunables. An incunable, plural is incunables, or incunabula in Latin. It's actually Latin for cradle, that or crib, or something like the beginning. The books which are the cradle of printing. These are the earliest printed books or pamphlets. Really, it's a collector's term, basically. The first 50 years of printing, roughly, pretty much from 1450 to 1500. And they're super expensive, and they're super collectible. I would love to have one someday. The earliest book I have is from 1560s. Not quite one of the incunables. These earliest books, they're about 30,000 titles, are the beginning of print culture. So we're going to talk a little bit about their forms and their printing and what they look like. The first thing to say is they look like manuscripts. If you look at the example there, that looks like it might have been written by hand. In fact, it's not. That is printing. Well, it doesn't look very much like, what is that? That's not Arial. That's not Garamond. That's not a font I know, Calibri. The idea was, I mean, think about it. If all people had ever known was handwriting manuscript, what are they going to make the first books look like? Handwriting. It's just like if all people have ever known are stage plays and suddenly we have television, what's the first television going to look like? stage acting, stage plays. The same with radio moving into television. There was also the sense that a manuscript was authentic. That was the prestige form, handwritten, handcrafted leather. And so books had a potential to seem kind of cheap, anybody can buy them. So the first books tried to look like they were handwritten. And that meant including the large capital letters, often done with woodcut, and there's a woodcut image down the side. They did everything, and a font which looks handwritten, even though it's a bunch of movable individual letters. So the first books tried to look like manuscripts, so they would still seem like authentic. Another feature of the early printed books, the incunables, is that they still retained this whole vast system of manuscript abbreviations. We talked in a previous episode about how manuscripts were written on parchment or vellum animal skin, and they didn't have a lot of white space because you don't want to waste that expensive material. And so, especially in Latin, they came up with a bunch of abbreviations, lines over letters, slashes through letters. If the word is really familiar and by context you know exactly what it's going to be, why take up the space of writing the whole thing out? That's true for common words. It's true for Latin with all of its inflectional endings. There are examples right there. See that NRI with a line over it? That's nostri. That's our, plural. And Deus, the word for God, very common. You don't really need the E and the U. You know what the word is in this context of the sentence. So D with a cross through it, S is Deus. FRS is fratres, brothers. Omnipotens, hey, that takes a lot of vellum to write that, is OM with a line, P, and then that's an S. And the line basically says, you know what these letters are. I don't have to write them. Fill in the stuff you know goes here. So here's an example it's from a manuscript. It says auxilium. Everyone knows that word for help ends in an M. Et aeternitatis. And that's aeternitatis because everyone knows how to spell that. Again, the line says fill in what I've left out. It's like an apostrophe. Don't, D-O-N apostrophe T says, the apostrophe says, hey, put in an O. I left it out. Ficiant sacramentum, where there are two lines. Sacramentum, you know what comes next. N and And per through is such a common preposition. It's just a P with a slash through it. Common forms of saving space used in manuscripts, they show up in the incunables. They show up in early printing because why wouldn't they? Printing becomes cheaper, but they still have this sort of scarcity mentality that we're going to use our abbreviations. Some features of early print orthography. Orthography means basically spelling, but also sort of letter formation. I mentioned that capitalization is super irregular. They haven't developed our rules yet. And if you've read Winnie the Pooh books, it's true there too, right? Pooh is a bear of very little brain, and the B in brain is capitalized. You'll notice that modern punctuation just has not developed yet. That's a little bit of a lesson to you, by the way. The correctness of the semicolon, they did not have semicolons. Or the correct use of the apostrophe, they didn't have them yet. So if you use terms like that is incorrectly punctuated, keep in mind that you're talking about rules that are only a couple of 100 years old. Did not exist yet. Some letters are doubled randomly. We'll see examples of that in a minute. Because spelling in the early modern period, has not been regularized. Some new letters are emerging. We now have a V and a U, but there's not really a distinction between them. Both V and U, sort of pointy U and rounded V, are used for V and U and interchangeably. Although you do tend to see V's more at the beginning of the word, even if it really is the vowel. You have two S's, the S and the esh, which we're familiar with from IPA symbols, or the S and the long S. they both make the S sound, but you'll find S at the end of the word most often, and elsewhere you'll find long S. If you look at the Constitution or Declaration of Independence from the 1700s, which is close to our period, a little bit later, you'll see long S's. They look like F's, which make it fun to listen to like middle school students read the like a manuscript of the Declaration of Independence, because they say F for all the S's. J is making its appearance in the world, but the first place it appears is in Roman numerals. You know, like I. The first place J appears is after a series of I's in Roman numerals. So J would be 4. That's where the J is coming from. It's really just a letter that says, hi, I will be your last I in this number, right? And there's some super common manuscript abbreviations. The ampersand, which we have still today for and. And then here's one with a fun story. An abbreviation that went awry and led to oh so many terrible mix-ups. Remember our good old thorn for TH? That's almost entirely gone, except that it survives in people writing the word the. Except that now we're in a period when people don't really know what that thorn is. It looks old-fashioned, antique to them. It's become misunderstood in the early modern period. And so they start writing the thorn as a Y. Let me say that again. The thorn in the begins to be written as a Y. So what does it look like? It looks like, to an early modern reader, ye. And that's a misunderstanding of a printing practice, which explains signs like this. You've seen them. Ye olde taco house, #1. Quote, I don't know what the quote means. Best Mexican food since 1962. I was going to ask you, what is the problem with this sign? Really, there are many problems with this sign. But that the oldie, that's what it says. It's the old, which was misinterpreted because they didn't know their thorns as ye old. So anytime you see a sign saying, ye old, soft drink or pop stand, it's not ye as in you, it's the, because they didn't know what a thorn was anymore. Well, Europe being Christendom, basically, mostly Christian nations, it was in fact essentially the state religion of most European regions and soon-to-be nations. It was illegal in Shakespeare's time to be an atheist, by the way. Some of the earliest printed books were, of course, Bibles. And it's very interesting to go back and look at the history of Bibles in English. Wycliffe, today there's the Wycliffe Society of Bible Translators. I've sent many linguistic students off to do that, translating the Bible into a language it does not exist in. You can look at Tyndale in the 1500s. These early Bibles were opposed by the Catholic Church, saying essentially, you'll mess it up if you put it into English. It won't be guarded over by the educated priests of the Catholic Church. It's too hard, the Bible is, to give it to everyone and just let them read it any way they want to, because it's really hard interpreting the Bible. But once the Church of England, the Anglican Church, breaks off from the Roman Catholic Church, we start to get English Bibles which are commissioned by the English monarchs who are the head of the English Church, such as Henry VIII. He commissioned a great Bible. Calvin, down in the mountains of Switzerland, does a Geneva Bible. But the one we're going to focus on is the KJV. Good date to remember, 1611. That's right toward the end of Shakespeare's career. So early modern period. I say early modern period, you say Shakespeare and the King James Version of the Bible. It's called the Authorized Version because, again, a king of England, also of Scotland, James, authorized it in exactly the way the Catholic Church did not authorize Wycliffe or Tyndale's Bibles. Translated by scholars at Oxford and Cambridge. And if there had been coffee tables back in the early modern period, around 1600, there would have been a Shakespeare and a King James version on those coffee tables. And if you came to America in the 1700s, maybe into the 1800s, and you had only two books, those books were most likely the Bible in the King James and the collected works of Shakespeare. So those works were hugely important in standardizing, disseminating this new modern form of English. They had enormous effect on reducing the number of dialects and giving everyone sort of a template for language. So even if Shakespeare had wrote terrible plays, or if the Bible was not believed by Christians to be the Word of God or containing the Word of God, they would still have huge linguistic importance because they gathered up the English language and modeled it after their own forms. So we're going to look at some of those. First of all, some print orthography in the 1611 KJV. There'll be questions about this on your assignment. Notice that we still look, even in 1611, that is 160 years after printing begins, rather manuscript-like. You think a person could have written that with their hand. So this is Paul's epistle to the Hebrews, and I'm going to read aloud what it says, and you'll fill in question answers on the homework sheet. So notice that's the epistle of Paul, spelled that way, who is the apostle to the Hebrews. There's a summary before chapter 1, which says, Christ in these last times, coming to us from the Father, is preferred, and that's above the angels, both in, can you read with me, person and office. And we're going to jump down to verse 3. Who being the, I'll pause to see if you can get it, brightness of his glory, dropping down, upholding all things by the word of his power, when, can you get that one? It's a pronoun. He had by himself purged our sins, sate, S-A-T-E, sat down on, interesting. That is a Y with an E above it. And that Y is supposed to be a thorn. And they've superscripted the E. So sat down on something, right hand of the majesty on high. Notice the capital letter. Notice the third letter too. Being made so much better. And we'll jump over to the next hand. That is for ever. Verse 9 starts, thou hast, we still have the hast form, thou hast loved righteousness. I simply point that out. The verse says, and thou, Lord, in the beginning, hath laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the works of thine hands. We wouldn't use a colon there, would we? Just pointing out the difference in punctuation. Theirs was random. It's almost like musical expression notes. It doesn't have the same values that we think of. So I read the King James Version of the Bible several years ago through because I was interested, and I kept a little collection of just oddities of ways that, yeah, that I understand, usually, sometimes not, but that's just a funny form, so that I could use it in this class. And I want to present to you, broken down by parts of speech, some ways that the 1611 KJV has some different verb forms, some different prepositional usages, some different noun forms, and meanings of all those words than today. So I'll ask you in the homework what these forms would be today. Some you might have to puzzle out, others you might have to look up, some just try and guess. You'll get it from context. So we'll just walk through these and enjoy English as it's on its way to being what we're familiar with, but not quite there yet. So verbs. I might be pointing these out for the meaning is changed. That's not how we use that word, as the OED would point out. Or maybe the past form of the verb is not the same as it would be today. The first is a past. Genesis 18, and he lift up his eyes and looked. Looked tells us that's past tense. Also a different past tense, and he builded an altar there. The Lord was with Joseph and shewed him mercy. That is a different vowel. And the people chode with Moses and spake. Different vowel in spake. What's that past verb, chode? And also it's used with a preposition with. They're upset with him, and so they chode with him. Think what modern word that would be the past tense of. Next, the cry of them is waxen great before the face of the Lord. So there's an outcry, and it's swelling up. What word would we use there? And what's the sense of wax? By the way, if you know German, you can look up the word wachsen, W-A-C-H-S-E-N, which means the same thing. A meat offering, they used the form bacon in a pan. Not B-A-C-O-N, but bacon. We would use a different past form of that. And they rose up betimes in the morning and swear one to another. The vowel has changed. There's this very common form that actually survived in England and in America for a while. He must needs go through Samaria. That is a past with modal. The modal is the need part. So there was a requirement in the past. How would we say that today? Jesus says, follow me, I will make you to become fishers of men. That's just a little different. And they digged down a well. By the way, some good vocabulary terms, grammar terms to have as you talk about these forms. We talk about strong and weak verb forms in the past. All English verbs form their past tense either in the strong fashion or the weak fashion. Let's start with the weak. The weak fashion is, it's weak in the sense of it goes along with the crowd and it adds ed. Like photocopy, photocopied. Inaugurate, inaugurate. Lifted. Inaugurate, inaugurated. Lift, lifted. That's weak because, hey, you just put on the ed. Strong past tense verbs change, do not add ed, but they change the vowel. They change the vowel in the root of the word. So very common, sing, sang, sung. That is strong. So you'll notice that some of these verbs are, in fact, not strong like they are, not weak like they are today, or not strong like they are today. You can use those words. Oh, and also, thinking of strong and weak verbs, that goes way back to German. German has the same thing, sing, sang, gesungen, for the same words. All those are ancient. The vowel change form of forming the past tense, eat, ate, is ancient. No new words entering the language are strong. They are all weak. So if a new word enters the language like to perflurple, it's going to be weak. And we'll know that the past tense is not perfleeple, but perflurpled with an ed. And then finally, as the Israelites are leaving Egypt, they're told by God to take along the gold, and you shall spoil the Egyptians. Does that mean give them lots of nice toys and make them feel all taken care of? No, think of another word that is close to that is what we're doing to the Egyptians by taking their gold. I will advertise thee. We didn't have an advertising industry yet, but I will advertise thee what this people shall do in the latter days. What is the speaker saying he's going to do? Ah, yes, and then the ones that deal with this topic. And he went in also unto Rachel. That's not about a doorway. The ewes and the she-goats have not cast their young. Can you picture a goat doing a baby goat tossing contest? That is not what's happening here. If you recall what happens, oh, right. Oh, these are laws about incest and also about nudity. A man shall not take his father's wife. That's that same subject. Nor discover his father's skirt. I love that. It sounds like you're going through your dad's, wardrobe and you discover he's a transvestite. No. What sense do you think is going on there in discover? And it was noised that he was in the house. What's going on? What would we say there? Back to Genesis. Benjamin shall raven as a wolf. We have the word ravenous, but we don't have the verb raven. They did. And Jesus answering said to him, suffer it. Do you know this meaning of the word suffer? Like suffer the little children to come to me. Suffer it to be so now, for thus it becometh us. Not it turns into us, but it is, think about becoming. In the other sense, to fulfill all righteousness. And then he suffered him. Sometime in your day, why don't you suffer someone else? Bring the men out to us. Oh, this is Lot and the strangers who ask for this, the two angels staying with Lot. Bring them out so that we may know them. Yeah, that's that same subject again. And then two meanings of cleave. We have cleaver today, the thing you cut meat with, and cleavage, the division of the breasts. But it had two opposite meanings at the time. You can cleave wood for the burnt offering, but his soul, I forget who that is, clave, that's the past tense, unto Dinah. So it is both, it has opposite meanings, to divide and also to undivide, to join. Some nouns are really fun. So this verse is about offerings to God in Leviticus. You shall offer at your own will a male without a blemish of the beeves. What, like Beaver Cleaver from the old TV show? Beeves, think French and animals. Benjamin's mess was 5 times so much as any of theirs. This is about a father spoiling his child, in the actual modern sense of the spoiled. Did Benjamin make a mess in his room? What did he get extra of? And the fame thereof was heard in Pharaoh's house. We're not talking about something which is famous like a celebrity. It has a rather more neutral sense back then. This is fun. Thou shalt set apart to the Lord all that openeth the matrix. So Keanu Reeves, first, Neo. This one is one of the hardest ones yet. Look at the first 4 letters of matrix. Set apart to the Lord all that openeth the what? See if you can figure it out. If you can't, look it up. I've given you the citation. There came out of the river. This is the dream of 7 fat years and then 7 years of starvation. 7 well-favored kine. That's a plural of an animal. You have to think of what animal. Hint, it's like children and brethren. Oh, and sustren. And Jacob sod pottage. He did what? He sod pottage. This is when Esau, his brother, is coming from the field and he's faint with hunger. And Jacob is busy sodding pottage. You can probably figure out what pottage is. What is something that is sodden? It's all wet. It's gotten wet. So what is doing, which Esau's really happy about? This one is interesting about purity laws and about gender and about that subject from the last slide. If any man lie with her, and her flowers be upon him, he shall be unclean 7 days. That is a really lovely way of saying something that is not what it sounds like. The last one is, go therefore now, and this is when the Egyptians are making bricks. All right, the Israelites, rather, are making bricks for the Egyptian. And they're, of course, cracked down on, and they're not given any straw to make bricks, which I guess you need to make bricks. So go and work, and you'll not get any straw, and yet you shall still deliver the same tale of bricks. Are we telling a story about bricks? Or are we supposed to deliver something else of bricks? Think about words that look a little bit like tale. And finally, I want to point out how slippery prepositions are. last point today. Prepositions have concrete meanings like on, like the pencil is on the table. But they also have metaphorical meanings. If something is on my mind, there's no literal onness going on, right? And because of that sort of metaphorical extension of prepositions being so unpredictable, prepositions tend to change their meaning quickly over time. So I'll read through these, and your question will be, what would this be in modern English? What prep would we use there? Even unto them that believe on his name. Mary was sitting over against the sepulchre. People could be possessed with the devil. That was an instrumental preposition. Jesus says, ye shall be hated of all men. The people did chide, we've seen that before, with Moses. God had respect unto them. If you respect someone, you have respect what them. But he seemed as one that mocked unto his sons-in-law. There, I don't think we use a preposition at all. We simply mock, but used to mock unto. You'd say, are you mocking unto me? Thou shalt stand by the river's brink against he come. Ooh, that's a completely different use of a preposition. Stand by the river. And when do you get to stop standing by the river? And then Jesus healing someone who has palsy, a disease. Jesus said unto the sick of the palsy, be of good cheer. I bet the person was pretty sick of the palsy at that time. How about, how long is it ago since this came unto him? How long has he had this disease? And he said, of a child. How would we say when the person first had that disease, if it's childhood? Oh, we're going to do adjectives too. And here, we're going to think about the forms of adjectives. And I want you to think about things like comparative and superlative. Oh, I have to give you more grammar terms, write these down. So there's the sort of base form, like good. And then in adjectives, there's better, which is comparative. And then there's superlative, which would be best. Good, better, best, long, longer, longest. And we also have some rules for how we do those. If we say something is longer, we would not really say it's more long. We would say longer. We add ER for comparative when it's one syllable. Right? That's why we don't say interestinger. We say more interesting. Did you know that rule? We also, just because we have imported like math and logic into our language, we don't like double comparatives or double superlatives because they're redundant. Like saying uniquest. Well, unique already means only one, and est also means the most extreme. It's like saying bestest, my bestest friend. That's a redundancy. So let's see if we have any of those forms in this. And whichsoever of you will be the chiefest shall be servant of all. That's a double something. Figure out which one it is. Comparative or superlative. This is simply a different use of the word. They gave large money, giant dollar bills of, what would we say? She was nothing bettered, but rather grew worse. How would we say that today? This is a meaning one. Then the Lord will make thy plagues wonderful. Have you had a wonderful plague? Think about the word wonder and what that word meant at the time in that context. Oh dear. In these lay a great multitude of impotent folk. They hadn't invented those little blue pills yet, I guess. That's not what that means. Think about the word potent and what it means generally, like potency of a drug. What would people who are generally impotent be? People who are blind, who are halt, and who are withered. What kind of physical illnesses would those people have? When he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he was an hungered. That's short for he was an hungered person. How would we say that today? Abraham was old and well stricken in age. We understand that. Do you see that comes from the verb to strike? Strike, stricken. So getting old has a metaphor of being hit by time. And this is about the Lord claiming his people. And the Lord hath avouched thee this day to be his, has claimed you to be his peculiar people. The Israelites, a peculiar people. How would we say that today? God's not saying they're unusual.